Let's begin with a short prayer. I just noticed last week that we had stopped doing that. Let us pray first that God will guide scientists and the medical people in our own country so that a cure may be found for the pandemic and a way of dealing with it may be found. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Amen. Okay, we're at 1600. 1600, a man by the name of Cornelius Jansen was professor at Louvain, and he became Bishop of Ypres. Louvain is in Belgium, and it's probably the premier, or at least one of the premier sites for studying theology, even to this day. Many people who are interested in going in for doctorates and for teaching will target Louvain. There's about 3 universities. One is in Louvain, one is in France, and another is in Germany that are really the best in the world today if you're going into that. So anyway, like many of the people of his day, he was trying to solve the mystery of how we are saved. It's a very, very difficult thing, this question of how we're saved. We talked a little bit about it with regards to Calvin, but we know God knows everything, and we know God can foresee the future. So at the moment of my creation, in fact, long before my creation, but at the moment of my creation, God knows exactly what my judgment will be at the end of my life. So does God create people knowing they're going to hell? See, that's a very difficult question. The other side of it is, does God create people knowing they're going to heaven? Now, that's no problem. We're all in favor of that, okay? But as soon as you accept that God creates people to go to heaven, which is what these different theologies take, as soon as they take that position, the other position there is, then are people created to go to hell? And that becomes a terrible thing in dealing with who God is. In the Catholic Church, it's a question we don't really discuss much anymore. It seems to be a dead-end question. But anyway, he wrote a huge book on St. Augustine's teaching, and without noticing it, Jansen so emphasized the concept of grace that he completely denied free will. So now he talked about how grace saves and God's gift of grace and everything, but in effect he denied that we had anything to do with it. Those chosen by God are saved, the rest of the people are simply lost. Now that's exactly the position of Calvin, but that's the position Calvin intended to hold. Jansen seems to have fallen into it by mistake as he was writing about grace. His teachings became known as Jansenism and brought about a tragically strict and penitential way of life. The reason why it became strict and penitential is he said that God created certain people to be saved, and you could tell saved people by the strictness of their life. And Jansenism, I probably mentioned this earlier, but Jansenism permeates the church in the United States. And one of the reasons was that Jansen was a priest in France, and the clergy that came to the United States came largely from Ireland, and Irish clergy were mainly educated at Douai in France because of the problems with the English in Ireland. So Jansenism spread very, very thin. And I'll give you some examples of Jansenism. An example of Jansenism is a priest in the confessional who's very strict, gives hard questions, and is really strict in the confessional. Jansen maintained that should be done. And that's part of Jansenism. Another thing, and I noticed this in my parents went to daily mass for periods of time. And my parents would go to communion only once a month. And on one Sunday of the month, they would go to communion. For the rest of the time, they didn't. Jansen preached against frequent communion. He was totally opposed to it because he says we're unworthy and all this sort of thing. So anyway, God was not seen as loving in his way, but is looking for a way to damn people and saving only a few people. Many are called, few chosen, that sort of thing. And the thing that is really interesting about this, he presents God who's really looking at our lives, seeing for some way that we could be lost. And if you think about it, just from a theological point of view, if God wanted me to be lost, all he had to do was nothing. We were all caught in original sin. If God wanted anyone to be lost, all he had to do was to do absolutely nothing. He doesn't need to search my life to find ways to condemn me. They're blatant. He doesn't need to do anything to cause me to be lost. The great thing of God is he wants me to be saved. And he gives me baptism to eliminate original sin. He gives me reconciliation to deal with the sin in my life. And he constantly calls me through grace. And what I see in scriptures is God is searching my life for any reason to save me, any reason at all to save me. And that's the God that we hold normally. But that's exactly the opposite of Jansen's God. San Cyprian was a priest chaplain at the convent of Port Royal. And this Port Royal is a famous place in France. And he taught the nuns Jansenism, which by now had become a mixture of errors, truths, authentic holiness, and political calculation. Under English rule, priests were required to leave the country to study to be Catholic, and the clergy were under an influence of Jansenism in France, as I mentioned, and to this day, Jansenism is a part of the church in this country. Anyway, these nuns in Port Royal then began to follow the Jansenism, and Jansenism was condemned by the Pope, largely the way it affected these nuns. I don't know if I've ever gone through the story with you, but Jansen taught that the key thing was to be as quiet and peaceful in God's presence and listen to God. And when you do that, over a period of time, they dropped music from the liturgy. The priest who celebrated was never allowed to be loud enough for them to hear because it would interrupt their prayers. Eventually, they stopped going to church because you could do that better at home and stuff. But the value of communion was lost, but discipline became strong. It's a very twisted way of looking at the faith. In 1640, we marked the beginning of a decade of social and political revolts. In the making of the world in which you and I live now, from a political point of view, this is almost the most important period, this decade. As a result of wars, plagues, famines, and general violence, most of the land had ended up in the hands of wealthy landlords. One of the things we're doing right now in the United States is going through the pandemic, and we're noticing that in the pandemic, the people who are suffering most are poor people because they're forced to live in closer proximity and they have jobs. And anyway, it really hits the poor. That was true in the Black Plague as well. And in the wars, peasants went to war, nobles didn't. So you have a lot of the very wealthy people who are sort of grabbing everything as these other people are dying off and that sort of thing. Only England and the Netherlands were immune to this situation. And one of the reasons they were immune is in both England and the Netherlands, the population had a real say. Do you remember that in England, they forced the king to sign, I forget the name of it now, but to sign a document that guaranteed the rights and everything of people. So they had a better control. In England and in Holland, the rulers were never absolute. Political leaders wanted more and more authority and had to battle nobles, aristocrats, and other countries. Taxes became unbearable to cover the wars. However, the nobles and the clergy were exempt. So the nobility and the clergy did not pay taxes. And then everyone else had this terrible burden of taxes. They were being sent off as soldiers, and they were being taxed to death. And now begins what went on. Catalonia, which, as you know, is an area of Spain, revolted against Spain in 1640. Naples and Sicily revolted against Spain in 1647. Portugal revolted against Spain in 1580. Charles I in England was an extremely strong supporter of the church in England. And remember, we saw other things were beginning in England, like Methodism under John Wesley and Puritanism. These were beginning in England. But he so strongly supported the Church of England that civil war broke out. And Charles himself was executed. The King of England was executed in 1649. All over France, people were turning away from the king, and in 1630, revolt broke out there. It was a period of chaos, and it was in response to this situation. There was a rise in what was called absolutism, which centralized an almost absolute power in a single individual. And so we see this idea of congresses and consultation, everything sort of disappeared now, and absolutism came. If you were to ever read Karl Marx, I think the book is Das Kapital, but one of the things Karl Marx said was, if you can bring chaos in society, society will be willing to accept any government at all to get them away from chaos. So I say, if you want to establish a communist government, you get people into chaos, and they'll accept everything. And this is what happened here. This is where Karl Marx saw that. So Louis IV was able to do this in France. So Louis IV, King of France, became absolute monarch, and he ruled completely. His word was law, period. Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia undertook great military campaigns financed by huge taxes, and they were able to extract these because nobles had absolute authority, because he gave the nobles absolute authority over the peasants. So what he did was, in his country, he took all the nobles and gave the nobles authority over all the people who lived in their area as though they were slaves. And then these nobles would enslave the people. These nobles then supported him in exchange for that. So he ended up with this absolute authority. But he did it by making the nobles these slave owners. In England, Oliver Cromwell came to power. Now, he was a Puritan, and he's the one who led the revolt against King Charles and had King Charles executed because they wanted freedom for the Puritan community. And he imposed a Puritan government, replacing the Church of England supporters. So everyone who supported the Church of England now was out, and the Puritans were in. In 1660, England returned to a government in which a king ruled. However, now the king ruled with the consent and cooperation of Parliament. So in each of these revolts, we see that the revolt causes chaos. It'll raise a despot. The despotism will be destroyed, and when that's destroyed, then we begin to see this shared government begin to develop. This period of history also saw the development of a very new style of art, and it's called Baroque. And Baroque is extremely ornate. Probably the best examples that you and I would see of Baroque art is the cathedrals and things in South America. Baroque art was coming on in this 1640, and no, that's the period where many of these big cities, Lima, Peru, and stuff like that, were coming up in South America, and they were building grand churches, and the churches are Baroque. If you were to look at a Baroque church today, I speak just for myself, I guess, when you look at it, you see there's too much. It's too busy. You can't really look at anything. There's too much to see. If there's an open space, there's an angel or a saint or something, but there's no open space in Baroque, the style of art. It appeared very first in Rome, There are a number of Baroque churches. Probably the most famous is the Gesù. The Gesù is the church that the Jesuits have in Rome. I think Ignatius of Loyola is buried there, but I don't know. I do know that Francis Xavier is buried there. Then this spread to the world. This very elaborate form of art was meant to display magnificence and importance. An interesting way in which you might see some of this, if you're familiar with San Diego and go to Balboa Park, a lot of those buildings are Spanish Baroque, and statues and everything all, but they glorify people and the importance of people and that sort of stuff. The Palace of Versailles is probably the very best example of Baroque art in the world. This style was adopted by the church because the period of reform had returned the church to its former importance in most European countries. Now remember, we watched, as history was going on, the church became more and more corrupt. And then with Luther's revolt, and the reaction to Luther's revolt, the church began to destroy this corruption. And we saw really holy people arise who wanted, reform and this sort of thing. And as a result of that, the church achieved its authority again. And what people don't realize, the authority of the church always rests on what people think of the church. So as the church becomes more holy, then people are drawn to the church and the church's power rises. But because we have money does not make us important. Because we have big buildings does not make us important. Because we can run governments doesn't make us important. As a church, your importance is holiness. If you produce holiness, you draw people. We can see someone like that, the great influence of Mother Teresa. When Mother Teresa went to India, one of the things she was told was they did not want her in India because there were too many people who were being taken from the Hindu faith and becoming Christians. So they would not let her come in and do her work. And remember, she felt called by God to care for dying people. So it didn't bother her. She said, I'll make an agreement that I won't do any teaching at all. I will never teach, and I will just go about my care for the dying. So they allowed her to work there. I think Mother Teresa made more converts than most people who ever went to India as missionaries. And why is it? Did she have money? No. Did she have authority? No. But what did she have? She had this internal power of holiness. And she made the church, like in India, if you thought of the Catholic Church anywhere in India, what you thought of was Mother Teresa. And that was the power of the church. That's always been the power. And as a lot of people, we go into an area and convert a lot of people. When we convert a lot of people, we tend to see that majority as a power. It isn't. We converted them because of the holiness. If we begin to play the power game, we will slowly lose them. It's happened several times in history. And the final thing about Baroque, there are many fine examples of this art in the churches of South America, which in fact were built by the natives. The 1500s, both Protestant and Catholic colonizers now saw themselves both as explorers and missionaries. And this is the point, incidentally, where at this point in history, there's only one international church, which is the Roman Catholic. But this is the first time the Anglican Church becomes an international church. And it becomes an international church because the English explorers carried the Anglican faith with them. I think you know that most of the explorers, in fact, were Catholic. So like you see Columbus and Cortez and all these, so they carried the Catholic faith. But as the English explorers began to go, they carried the Anglican faith. In England, it was called the Church of England. As countries became independent, like when the United States became independent, the Church of England reorganized itself under the name of the Protestant Anglican Church, and or Anglican Protestant, something like that. But they dropped the name England. So, however, in most cases, the reason for the exploration seems to be greed. Okay, most times, greed is a pejorative way to say it, but they oftentimes were interested in gold. In the Americas, they were interested in gold. The English on the East Coast were interested in farming and that sort of thing. But in this process, they would grab territory and preach their particular faith. Most of the explorers wanted to make good European citizens of the natives, but there were those who wanted to enslave or simply kill the natives. And we watch that through history. Probably the most dangerous people with regards to the natives were the Spanish and the Portuguese, because they had seen war drive out the Muslims. So they connected conversion, in fact, with war. The blunt truth is that every one of these goals presumed to be disastrous for the natives. So if they came over because they wanted to educate and help the natives, a la Father Sarah, it proved to be disastrous for the natives, largely because of disease and things like this, okay? If they came over to conquer and take the gold and stuff like that, like with regards to Cortez, it proved disastrous because then the natives were killed and that sort of thing. But every one of these, even with the best of intentions, it was proving disastrous for the natives. Spain was the very first of the colonizers and conquered a large part of western United States, as well as almost all of South America. The feat was accomplished with much cruelty and suffering, as I think is true of every conquest. In Mexico and Peru, it was Cortez and Pizarro. They sent huge amounts of gold and silver back to Spain as they moved through the land and left behind settlements. So they would leave Spanish settlements as they looted the land and went through. One of the tragedies is they saw no value in Native American art. To them, it looked primitive. A lot of that has been lost. And as they went through, they sent back this gold. I may have mentioned before, but if you ever get a chance to visit Rome, one of the churches, there's a group of basilicas you visit, and one of them is called St. Mary Major. Major, incidentally, doesn't mean important, it means first, okay? Like, for instance, in the Apostles, we have James the Greater and James the Less. Well, James the Greater is just the James who was called first. The second one, called James, is called James the Less. Anyway, Mary Major was the first church built to honor Mary in the Western Church. But when you go in, look up at the ceiling. It is gilded, and it is the very first gold brought back to Spain from the New World. It was given to King Ferdinand, and he and Isabella donated it to gild the ceiling of St. Mary Major. There were sharp and deadly disagreements between missionaries and settlers on the treatment of natives. Missionaries in general, Protestant as well as Catholic, but missionaries in general tried to protect the natives because they were thinking of building a church. And if you look at it, the people who wanted to settle wanted to create European settlements. So they would like to see the natives enslaved and ultimately eliminated because it was to be a European settlement. So they let them die off through slavery. The missionaries wanted to establish the faith in the natives who would carry on the faith and everything. And so it's a very different approach to the natives. In the East, the Spanish moved into Florida and their settlements were established. They went on to establish places in New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and California. These were mainly to protect routes of transferring gold from the New World to Spain. They wanted to have ports where they could send the gold out, and they wanted to have ports where they could keep ships to protect the ships who were going out. Over a period of time, Spain will begin establishing things like San Diego and stuff like that in an effort to keep the Russians from moving down. The Russians had built Fort Ross in San Francisco, and so they did not want the Russians moving down. The Russians owned Alaska, and they did not want the Russians moving down into California, so they would establish that way. Initially, The process of establishing settlements was carried out under a system called ecomedia, in which a certain number of natives were assigned to each settler on condition that the settler agreed to instruct them in the Catholic faith. But in almost every case, the natives ended up slaves and were worked to death. So as Spain went in, they set up a territory, they put the Spanish group in charge, and the natives worked for them. The condition was the natives would be educated. They found out before very long there is a disadvantage to having slaves educated, because then they would read and discover about different things and that sort of stuff. So they did not want the slaves educated. In fact, in the United States, I think at one time, it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write. The Spanish priest, like Bartholomew de las Casas, raised such an outcry against the evils of this system that it was finally abandoned in 1600. Then the Spanish colonies began a second phase. The idea was to rescue the natives from a nomadic existence and settle them into towns, okay? So the natives were kind of nomadic. Now in California, they weren't nomadic. And the reason they weren't really nomadic in California is because they had everything they wanted. In California, they really didn't need clothing. It never got that hot, never got that cold. They didn't need to look for food. They lived on abalone and stuff they would gather. The life was actually ideal. The density of population, native population, probably highest in Southern California than it was anywhere else in the Americas. And they didn't have wars and that sort of thing. On the East Coast, the natives used to largely travel. And they would travel to hunt the buffalo and where different crops were available and stuff. And they moved around. If you take something like Grand Canyon, the natives would stay on the top of the canyon through the summer, and they'd stay in the bottom of the canyon through the winter, because it was warmer in the bottom of the canyon and colder at the top. So we watched the natives do things like that. In California, though, like the rest, the natives never really had permanent cities. That was not something that happened in North America. South America, the Aztecs, the Mayans, they had cities. But up here, that was not the thing. And so the few cities that were established by the Native Americans up in the northern part were largely the Anasazi. And they're the natives who disappeared a long time ago. But you can see their ruins a lot in, let's say, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, that you can find the remains of their settlements. And they built cities and were farming. But that wasn't the norm of the natives, okay? So what they wanted to do was establish towns. Europeans are used to towns, so they want to establish towns. And this was the system invoked when they came to California. The native would be brought to a mission where they would learn the skills necessary for the functioning of a town. And for about 200 years, this system functioned well. So like the Father Serra would come in, he'd establish a mission. He would establish we speak of these in history as people involved in towncraft. Now, who do you need in towncraft? You need someone who knows how to make bricks. You need someone who knows how to work metal, a blacksmith. You need a farmer who knows about crops and rotation of crops. So you needed these individuals in order for a town to exist. I always think of the brick-making thing. If you ever get a chance, there's the ruins of a magnificent home. I can't think of where it is now. It's in Louisiana somewhere, but it's a magnificent home, and it's great pillars in front. It would have looked something like the Parthenon in Greece, had it ever been completed. But they just got a bunch of natives together and put them together, mixing the concrete and putting the thing. And do you know what they did wrong? They used seawater. So they used salt water in the concrete and everything, and then it all began to disintegrate over a period of time. And so, you think making bricks is a simple thing. It is not. None of these things are simple. And so they would leave individuals, and they would train Native Americans to do that. As soon as there were enough Native Americans trained to do that, what the Spanish government would do, and this worked all through many areas of South America, they would take over the area. Like, for instance, here, they would take over the mission, and then what they would do is to the Catholic Church, they would give the mission and the houses the priests were living in. The rest of the buildings of the mission became government buildings. In front of the mission, they would build a huge plaza, and around it, they'd put buildings that were government buildings. All the rest of the land would be divided up equally and divided equally among all the natives who had gone through all the training, and they would go on and run the town. Soldiers and everything would leave, and they would go on with the town. And that was the system that was supposed to work. For a while, the system functioned fairly well for those natives who survived. The two main problems were soldiers who were present to protect the missionaries had been used to the old system where the natives were enslaved and often abused the natives. That was the problem in California. The soldiers who came up here, they would constantly see the natives as less than human and abuse them. Now imagine the soldiers. The soldiers normally came here in order to make enough money to have a living when they went home. But they were young men. They usually, well, if they were married, their wives weren't here with them. And they were here on the effort to make money. Now, it's hard for us to imagine how desperate an individual would have to be to sail from Europe to the New World. So these people were desperate people. And when they came in, they abused, they used the natives, they stole from them, they raped them. It was a horrendous thing. Father Serra finally started trying to separate the natives from the soldiers by building presidios. So you have a presidio in Monterey, and the natives were at Carmel Mission. You have a presidio in San Diego, and the natives were at the San Diego Mission. But you see that take place in an effort to save the natives. Just as the idea of crossing the ocean, I don't know about you, I would be very cautious getting on a steam liner to go, I don't know where there's steam, but getting on a liner to go across the ocean today because of just the distance and stuff like that. I would be apprehensive about it. There's a museum in the city of Winnipeg, and it's a museum that deals in Canadian culture and stuff like that. And you go into the basement, and the basement of the museum, now this basement is no larger than the building. In the center of the basement is a swimming pool. And on the swimming pool are 3 ships. And they're beautifully made Spanish galleons. And you look at them, and you think they're models. They are exact replicas of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They are exact replicas. I would not get on one of them in Monterey Bay, let alone cross the ocean. But the soldiers did, so they were desperate. The diseases that were natural but unknown, brought by the Europeans, this system fell into decay with the independence of Mexico from Spain. Once Mexico became independent of Spain, then the mission system was abandoned. So like in California, we never had the missions long enough to train the people to actually run cities. So that never went on. The 1600s this period saw the arrival of colonizers from England, and most of these were people who did not want to worship in the Church of England. And while they were Protestant, they wanted the freedom to practice their own faith. So there would be like Calvinists, who mainly were in Scotland, but Calvinists from England would come over here to practice their faith. The Puritans were being persecuted by the Church of England, and they came over. Methodists were being persecuted by the Church of England, and they came over. And these individuals came over. The spread of the English in this area was often due to the separation of these early colonies into different religious faiths and the move to a new area. So like if we were, let's say we're a group of Calvinists and we come over, well, we don't want to go into a colony that was established by, let's say, the Methodists, because we'd just come out of being a minority in England. We were persecuted by the Church of England. So we wanted to establish our own community so that we would have our independence. And that's how there got to be so many colonies on the East Coast, that they were usually individually religious groups that fled persecution, largely in England. There was even an English colony of Catholics, and that was around Baltimore, and that's why the state became known as Maryland. The Catholics established it, basically. In Pennsylvania, a religious settlement was founded by a Quaker idealist, William Penn. This is, William Penn is one of the most important people in his influence on what the United States is today. He came over as a Puritan. He was an idealist. He was a scholar and a peaceful man. Quakers tended to be very peaceful. Scholars, not a lot of them, but they tended to be people of peace. His colony was unusual because non-Quaker settlers were welcomed. So when he settled his colony of Quakers, he did not discriminate against any other group that came to join them. Now, admittedly, not a lot of groups would go in with, like if you came over as a religion, you didn't go into another group's majority, but anyone who did was welcomed. Many Catholics and Puritans who did not agree with the Puritans actually found refuge there. So if you're a small group of Catholics living in different areas, you knew that if you weren't up in a Catholic area, you could find freedom of religion with the Quakers, so they would move in there. His idea of religious freedom and his approach to it is canonized in our Constitution. In Georgia and the Carolinas were both founded and then colonized mainly for trade. Religion was not much of a factor for these colonies. However, there developed in these colonies a strong resistance to conventional Anglicanism. And incidentally, it was not called Anglicanism at this time, it was called Church of England. However, it may just have been a resistance to the royalty in England. So in Georgia and the Carolinas, because they were interested in trade and they were interested in making money, if you were good at that, they didn't care what your religion was, with the exception of members of Church of England, because they didn't want the control over them that they had encountered while in England. All these colonies came together over a period of time to form the United States of America. Almost every form of Protestantism, as well as Roman Catholicism, would be represented at that time. In this day and time, this religious pluralism was the most striking feature of the colonies, okay? So if you were to look over at us at that time, they would say the most striking feature is this variety of religion. At this time, religions were very, you were a Catholic country like Spain and you drove out the Muslims and the Jews, or you were a Calvinist thing like Switzerland, you drove out the Catholics, the Jews, the Lutherans, so we see all this going on. But the United States was actually a place of religious pluralism, and that was probably the most striking feature. This period also saw the arrival of French explorers and traders. Of all the colonizers, they were the least racist and the most accepting of the native style. And as I've told you before, my family is from the Assiniboine tribe, which is in Canada. We were converted by French Jesuits. And where the French went, they had a tremendous respect for the Native Americans. And while the Spanish felt they were above the Native Americans, many of them intermarried. Okay, the English did not intermarry. The English would not intermarry with the natives, but you found like the Portuguese and the Spanish did, but they considered them inferior. The French did not consider them inferior. The French had this idea that it was a very different culture, not inferior, but in fact they were two very different cultures. Okay? The beginning of France as a power in the New World began when the king gave a monopoly on the fur trade to one company, and it was headquartered in Quebec. And by Quebec, I mean Quebec City, not the province of Quebec. Rather than a colony, Quebec was a trading center. So as Quebec was there, what you did, you had traders. And a lot of the traders, incidentally, were Catholics from Scotland. But you had these traders that would go out and they would trade for pelts with the Native Americans, and they brought them in to this company called the Hudson Bay Company, because the Hudson Bay was the area around which all the fur trade. And from there, the Hudson Bay Company had forts set up where they would accept the trade, and the trade then would go into Quebec, and Quebec then took it to France. In the early days, there were fewer than 100 French people in New France, and a few Franciscans began to preach to the natives. Okay? In 1632, the Jesuits were put in control of missionary activity in the French area. Remember that this was a great period of religious reform for the Catholics of France. Okay, now France, remember, was in a period of reform at this time. There was reformation of the church going on. 54 Jesuits were spread out along the St. Lawrence River Basin and as far south as upstate New York. So these 54. Now remember, we said there were 100 native Frenchmen, and now we found 54 of them were priests. It tells you that we're not colonizing, you know. So anyway, one of the tribes called the Huron were very receptive of the faith, but the Iroquois killed several of the missionaries. And one of the things when you study the missionaries, French missionaries, there are a number of martyrs who died as they came over, and they're known as the North American martyrs. But there are a number of martyrs who died while trying to present the faith to the Native Americans. But you do not find soldiers with them. So as a result of that, you do not see massive amounts of natives being murdered. You do not see that in the system. Missionaries occasionally are killed. If you study the Franciscans and everything in California, very few were ever killed. But a lot of the natives were killed because of the soldiers. Okay? The Mohawks were one of the tribes of the Iroquois nation, and a daughter of one of the chiefs became a Catholic, eventually canonized, Kateri Tecumseh. Incidentally, in Mohawk, her name is Gatali, but Kateri Tecumseh is called the Lily of the Mohawks. The Mohawks were the most anti-Catholic of the groups. They killed a number of missionaries and everything. And Kateri's mother was an Algonquin, and she was taken captive. The Assiniboine are part of the Algonquin nation. The Mohawk are part of the Iroquois nation, okay? So she was taken as a slave, and in Indian, Native American function, if you have a slave and you want to marry her, you have to give her her freedom. So he took his slave and went before their council, and he has to give her her freedom. And then in front of the council, he has to propose to her to marry him. And she is free to leave as a free woman. She's free to stay in the tribe and live as a free woman. and she's free to marry him. But they believed in their tradition you couldn't enter into marriage without freedom. So he gives her her freedom, and she does love him, so she marries him. They had a daughter, and their daughter is Gadali. And when their daughter is born, they have the epidemic, smallpox. He dies, her mother dies, her brother dies, and she suffers from blindness for the rest of her life. She is adopted into an uncle's family, and because of her father, she is Mohawk royalty. So she has sort of a level in the community. She listened to teachings. Her mother would never have her baptized. Her father wouldn't have allowed it. And I'm not sure she ever studied the faith or anything. But anyway, she became enamored as the missionaries came. And because at that time the Native Americans were organizing with the French against the British, that the Native Americans demanded that the Iroquois and the Mohawk allow the missionaries in. They didn't have to convert, but they had to allow the missionaries in or they couldn't be a part of that coalition. So they joined the coalition, and then when Gadali wanted to be baptized, she had to leave the tribe where she was, her uncle and everything, and she went over to a neighboring village, and just by coincidence, she was baptized in the same building where the North American martyrs were martyred. She was baptized in that building, and then she came back as a Christian into her own community with her uncle. And she went through a lot of abuse and everything in her life, but she was protected by the fact that she was royalty, and she had to be allowed to practice her faith because she was at that time baptized. So she went on that way. French explorers and the Jesuits with them went south along the Mississippi to where St. Louis and New Orleans now stand. Mission stations were established in Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. It was along this trail of missionary journeys that the Jesuits came to be called black robes, okay? As they would travel, they always wore their habit. So they came at this point in history to be known as black robes. And when you use the term black robes, even though all priests would be wearing exactly the same thing, the term black robes always refers to Jesuits. The missions began to decline when the British began to push into New France, and ended with the suppression of the Jesuit order. Okay, so when the Jesuit order is suspended, or suppressed, then these missions, everything, are all abandoned. The Roman Catholic Church at this time tried to expand into Eastern Europe and was able to restore the faith in Bohemia and Lithuania. And by restore the faith, you see it had been Catholic, but as the shifting of the Muslim forces and the forces of Constantinople, it had all been taken over by the Orthodox. So the Orthodox maintained churches in this area. Poland had remained Catholic, but both Poland and Hungary had large portions of Orthodox Christians. In a move that was remarkable for the time when you consider it, the Church decided that any Orthodox who returned to the authority of the Pope could retain their customs and ceremonies. And that's why, like for instance, in the town here, we have the Byzantine Catholics. Now the Byzantines would be connected with Constantinople, what was originally called Byzantium. But when they decided to restore their relationship with Rome, they retained their ceremonies. You go in, the inside of their church is very different. Their services are very different. They retained their own services and their own method of celebrating sacraments and stuff. This practice led to the practice of many of the Orthodox recognizing the authority of Pope, but meant much resistance among both Orthodox and conservative Catholics. Conservative Catholics didn't think they should be allowed to come in with their own services and everything. So conservative Catholics reacted against it. And then a lot of the Orthodox thought that the Catholic Church was stealing people from them. Moscow, since Constantinople had been destroyed, sort of emerged as the center of Orthodox Christianity. And the church began a strong spiritual renewal in Russia. The Russians were taking their new position in the world as center of orthodoxy very seriously. So they saw that they were the center of all this. There'd already been a strong history of saints and monks in Russia, okay? Like, for instance, when we think of the structure of a church, we think of, bishops and the patriarch, the way that's set up. And that's sort of a political system. A holiness system is seen in monks and hermits and stuff. So these two things kind of operate independently. The monks are under the authority of the patriarch, but the authority, it doesn't mean much. The authority, because it's sort of a political thing, the patriarch doesn't care much about what the monks are doing. They aren't out preaching in the parishes and stuff like that. So they just sort of leave them. And the monks and the hermits were then spiritual directors for people, but largely lived in this separate way. In 1652, the patriarch died. His son became the new patriarch. His name was Nikon. And he set about a series of reforms to make the Russian church more like what the Greek church had been. So they saw themselves as the new Constantinople. So they began to develop their church in that way. Many of the ordinary people were completely offended by the changes, and they formed a group that still exists today, and that group is known as the Old Believers. Okay? So we'll call it there and pick it up there next week. Thank you very much.